I'm joined now by someone who's perhaps best known for his work as a director on series such as Coronation Street, Emmerdale, El Dorado, and Brookside, to mention but a few. But of course, before that, he worked on all sorts of shows whilst training at the BBC. So I'd like to introduce Henry Foster. How are you?
Well, thank you for inviting me, Alex. It's lovely to meet you. And yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Your email came out of the blue saying, would I subject myself to the indignity of being interviewed on Zoom, and embracing the opportunity to do so. What did I do? I worked on a few Doctor Who's, loved it. It was great fun. Because I think when in my early BBC career, I was doing Play for Today and working with Dennis Potter and things like that. It was all terribly serious and all the rest. And then sort of moving into things like Doctor Who, it was fun because it was, nobody knows what Doctor Who is really about, except we all do in a funny kind of way. But it was great outlet for sort of creativity and so on. And actually looking back at the Destiny of the Daleks recently, I see my name come up, Henry Foster, production assistant. You go, what? Production assistant? That's the person that makes the continuity notes and so on. But the BBC, in its own way, just had to give its own names to jobs, which in the rest of the industry are categorized in different ways. And we then, instead of being production assistants, we did become production managers, which kind of identified our job a bit more accurately. But I think the production manager was actually Chris, who was the production manager? John Nathan Turner, wasn't it? And John Nathan Turner subsequently became the producer, but essentially the production assistant was the first assistant director. You'd have to find the locations, you'd do the logistics of filming, you'd run the studio floor, you'd run the studio shoot, you'd worry about where cars parked and where people stayed the night and all the rest. So it was a massively all-embracing job, which was a lot of fun.
I can imagine, these days that job is done by so many different people. It must have been an incredible learning curve to be sort of thrown in the deep end, really, and expected to deliver all of that.
Well, I mean, of course, nowadays, you'd probably be supported by a production manager and a location manager and this, that, and the other. But you wear all of those sort of things. So thing about Doctor Who is you go knocking on somebody's door saying, I'm looking for a location to film Doctor Who and the Daleks. And you go, oh, what? And suddenly, people would really respond because they've never heard of a Dennis Potter Play for Today, but Doctor Who and the Daleks. Wow, that was, just part of everybody's culture. Even if they didn't watch it, they knew what it stood for. So it did make life a lot easier. And certainly when you worked with Tom Baker and you were on location, a whole lot of school kids would come along and they go, oh, what Doctor Who there? And he'd go, yeah, I've seen you watching me. And that was very much sort of Tom's calling card. He would really empathize with his audience.
Because your first story with Tom, The Destiny of the Daleks, sort of had it all. Daleks, quarries, alien robots, it was so much thrown at you. But I suppose if you're going to do Doctor Who, you want a quarry and Daleks. So was that perhaps the most memorable of the stories you worked on?
Yeah, I think the other Doctor Who's I did, I think were all studio productions. So yeah, and Doctor Who didn't go out on location that much. So yeah, that was fun. It was a worry because it was early days of the health and safety executive, and we needed the sandpit because that's where the spaceship landed. But we also, the quarry gave a sort of exotic feel. But it was quite a dangerous location. And of course, all the responsibility lay entirely on my shoulders. It wasn't the director's responsibility, So, if an explosion caused rocks to fall and so on, I could have been held liable. And I was always very worried, certainly when we were in the quarry. You'd look up at the top and people walking along the coastal path and you think, if they see the Daleks down there, are they going to try and look over the edge, and are they going to fall over the edge? To say nothing of your own crew. You know, there was a big worry about the public. And of course, we were having explosions too. So I phoned up the Coast Guard and I said, yeah, we're doing some filming at Kimmeridge, and there are going to be some explosions. So if anybody phones you up during this week, you know, it's only the BBC filming Doctor Who and the Daleks. And they went, oh, what? Can we come and watch? And we said, no, you can't come and watch. You know, I'm telling you so that, you know, if anybody phones up, then you're already forearmed. But it was, quite difficult to try and keep the location secret because inevitably there would be some Doctor Who freaks who would find where you were. In those days, usually by CB radio, funnily enough. I think the Grips was a CB freak. And anyway, you always got some hangers-on, which was quite funny. But the location I thought worked quite well, actually. And certainly looking at the DVD, I was quite impressed at how well it had been graded. I'm sure when it went out first time round, we used to, on location, we used film, and in the studio, we'd use videotape. And the quality of picture on both of them is totally different. And so you get a sort of grainy, filmy effect for the telecine stuff, and then a sort of bright, glossy studio. But I think, and I don't think the grading was terribly sophisticated in the late 70s when these Doctor Who's went out.
Well, of course, you know, these days we're used to everything being in HD and so much sharper, but times have certainly changed. Well, I wanted to ask about Daleks in quarries. You know, they're not a prop designed to go out and about, really. So I imagine that problem was something that you had to solve.
I can't believe you've even asked me that question. Of course, Daleks can go anywhere they like. They can even climb stairs, and I believe. Douglas Adams certainly put some nice little twists in the script about, I wonder how the Daleks get around. And of course, Daleks run on little casters that are about that big. So you've got a guy sitting on a seat inside the Dalek shell, shoveling his feet, trying to make this thing go around. Then he's got to swivel his sink plunger and do all that at the same time. And so if you're in a sand pit or in a quarry, the terrain isn't entirely suitable for little supermarket wheels. So we would put tracking boards down, so 8x4 sheets of plywood, and tape them together, and the Dalek would hit the join and go, and then get over the join and go on to the next join. So, you know, essentially the foreground Dalek could move maybe 20 feet or so tops. But we did have a lot of fun on Destiny of the Daleks because BBC owned 3 Daleks, and BBC Enterprise had 1 Dalek, and we had to negotiate with BBC Enterprises, which was the commercial arm, that we could use their Dalek for filming. So we actually had 4 Daleks. But Peter, the visual effects guy, then made some plastic Daleks out of vacuum formed plastic because we had to blow Daleks up. And I said to Ken Grieve, you know, we can have our good Daleks in the foreground on their pieces of 8x4 trundling past the camera like this. But on the right over on the edge of the shot, on the edge of the quarry, we could have some Daleks on the lip of the quarry. So the people they were fighting, I said, guys, can you get inside these plastic Daleks? And when we say action, don't straighten your legs, but just kind of waddle along like this inside the plastic Dalek. So we went, okay, turn over, action! And all of the Daleks on the edge of the quarry sprouted legs and started walking along the edge of the quarry. The camera started shaking like this because the whole crew were corpsing like crazy. Good memory.
So I imagine after the trials and tribulations of being on location, getting into studio must have been quite a relief, because I'm right in thinking at this point, all of location work would have been done first, then you're into 4 days worth of studio.
Yes, I can't remember whether it was 4 days on the Daleks or not, because we'd had an entire week's worth of filming, which theoretically would have paid to two studio days. So I don't know whether we had less studio time. The irony is, of course, that you go on filming location not having rehearsed anything, and then go into the rehearsal room for a week or so to rehearse it, and everything's done in the rehearsal room, and the Daleks know what they're doing. So you're not quite, so when you go into the studio, you're not making it up because everybody's done their homework. What I do remember is David Goodison, who played Davros, he had to have a prosthetic mask put on. And I think it was fiendishly uncomfortable. I think it was rather old and decrepit anyway. And there wasn't money to refurbish it or remake it. So poor old David had to have this thing plastered all over his face. And I think we could only record with him for half a day, because I think he sat in the makeup chair for something like 3 or 4 hours, then did a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours recording in the studio, and then ripped it off with a sigh of relief. And I suspect, having looked at the Doctor Who DVD, I don't think he could see very much through his latex mask, because half the time Tom Baker seems to be steering him around. And poor thing had to give a performance and steer his Dalek base and sweat buckets, all for the name of art.
Yes, it's a great performance he gives through the limitation of the mask, certainly. But after the challenges of Daleks and masks that don't perhaps work, your next story was entirely studio-based, The Horns of Naimon, but you still had perhaps not the easiest characters to work with. Was that more straightforward than Destiny?
No, it was. They both had their challenges. With Ken Grieve, who directed Destiny of the Daleks, he was somebody who came from ITV, and he was a sort of unknown quantity. He wasn't BBC at all. Actually, Ken had been a cameraman, and he really knew what he was doing. And he, I think, even by today's standards, that is really well shot. I think it's a slightly creaky script. But we've then had Kenny Mcbain, who came in from the theatre, and he'd just done the director's course at the BBC. And so this was, he was cutting his teeth on the Horns of Naimon. And actually, Doctor Who is a tough call for any director, let alone a rookie one. And, we were very good techies and could pull him through, but I mean, I wouldn't be as, Ken knew exactly what he wanted. He then went on to produce Morse, of course, and then died sadly young. But he was, he got very good performances out of a superb cast. I mean, you get people like Graham Crowden. Graham Crowden was just a sublime person to work with, but of course he upped Tom Baker's game too, because suddenly there was somebody. Tom Baker, would always go see how far he could push you, and you when you've got somebody of Graham Crowden's caliber, you can't go very far. But with me, for instance, I was cueing Tom once. He'd been zapped by a Dalek or whatever. And he was lying on the floor, and I said, okay, we're going for a take in 5, 4, 3. Waved my arms again. He said, Henry, stop waving your arms in front of my face. I'm acting. And I said, well, Tom, I'm sorry to say, I thought you might have actually died. And, that kind of sort of badinage was, he knew that he would he would give as good as he would take. So I mean, he was challenging but fun. And I think he got on with both of those directors very well. Horns of Naimon, yes. The other thing I remember about Horns of Naimon, of course, it was the end of that particular series, and I think all the money had been used up. And so John Nathan Turner was running a very tight ship in terms of how many extras we could have and, you know, how much money the designer could spend and so on. And so it was kind of grabbing at short ends and trying to make something out of it. I haven't seen Horns of Naimon for years and years and years. I've no idea how that stands up. Maybe you can tell me.
I think it's a great science fiction take on the story of the Minotaur, but perhaps knowing the budget issues at the time, you know, sets are recycled and relit as different planets. But I think it does stand up well. If anything, it's the video effects that date it. But then, you know, we're talking about something that is 40 years old. Times have changed.
This is true. I think, was it the same designer? Was it Ken Ledger Mcbain? I think it might have been.
It was a chap called Graham Story designed.
Oh, of course. Sorry, Graham Story, absolutely. Yeah, he went on to do lots of good stuff too. You know, you bump into people that worked on Doctor Who down the ages, and you can always have a sort of good old chat and a laugh about your mutual experiences of the various doctors and the privations of not having enough money and rather creaky visual effects and so on. I mean, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we do nowadays that we really do take for granted because it's terribly simple. I was working on things like My Parents Are Aliens and so on, and we did some extraordinary stuff with green screen and CGI and all the rest. Again, on a very limited budget. You know, with in the 70s, we were, you know, what you saw is what you got, kind of, and a spaceship hung on a bit of string and flew across a black screen and was then matted into something else. Yeah, quite fun making telly like that.
Yeah, I suppose it's worth noting that Destiny of the Daleks was one of the first use of Steadicam by the BBC ever, not just for Doctor Who. You know, it was a show that was pushing the envelope, and for a director, it must have been incredibly challenging. You know, certainly technically, let alone as an actor. Do you think it was a challenge you would have enjoyed at the time?
Yeah, I would have done. I personally didn't use Steadicam a great deal, although it is very liberating. And Ken Grieve, of course, was a cameraman, so he could actually totally appreciate the possibilities of Steadicam. And of course, you know, for us at the BBC, oh, you know, this is Hollywood meeting Doctor Who, and you know, we're groundbreaking. And it was Fred, one of the cameramen at Ealing, who learned how to use it. And I think the early Steadicam kit was pretty bulky, quite heavy. Nowadays, you see guys running up and down football pitches for hours with their Steadicam, and I don't know what it does to their bodies, but the early Steadicam was a little bit on the crude side, but it actually delivered some very good results. But then I think we did quite a lot of handheld as well. So yes, that was exciting, and it was groundbreaking because people, you know, became part of one's toolkit in the end.
You found yourself working with Peter Davison on your final Doctor Who story, brought to Doomsday, which was actually the first story he recorded. At that time, you know, he hadn't been seen on television at all. What was the sort of atmosphere on set? Was there sort of nervousness or confidence that he would make it his own?
I can't remember. Was John Nathan Turner producing the show by then? Okay, so John was a new producer, and he brought in Peter Davison, and they, I think, formed a friendship on All Creatures, which was the program that made Peter Davison's name. So, well, I suppose as a production team, we went, okay, it's a new Doctor. So, you know, it's the end of the Tom Baker era, and we'll see what Peter Davison brings with him. But, you know, it was almost like the transition of on James Bond, when, it's Sean Connery becomes another actor, and you go, ooh, all right, well, you roll with the punches and get on with it. Peter Davison came in his rather smart cricket outfit, and he gave something new to it. And I think he actually had an innate understanding of the slightly camp element of Doctor Who, which Tom Baker certainly had. I mean, Tom Baker, I think, probably defined Doctor Who, certainly in that era. And, that was a tough act to follow. So I felt very sorry for Peter Davison having to sort of fill some quite large shoes. And I think he did it with great aplomb. I can't remember much about the story. I think we had to do some spacewalks and things like that, didn't we? Yes. A bit of sort of rudimentary green screen chroma key work and so on, which I'm sure looks a bit dodgy now.
Perhaps most notably, you had Stratford Johns under a sort of alien prosthetic who I imagine must have been quite a character and sort of perfect for that sort of slightly camp world of Doctor Who.
Alan Stratford Johns was a delight, again, because, he had been a big star in his telly star in his day. We weren't quite sure what we were going to get with him. Actually, he was a hell of a nice guy. Rather like Davros, he had this ghastly sort of prosthetic put on him and so on. And I've got quite a nice story about that, because his character was based on a poison tree frog. So I went to the Natural History Museum, and this is the Doctor Who thing too. You go, hello, I'm from Doctor Who, and I'm doing some research on poison tree frogs. And they went, what, Doctor Who, really? Oh, wow. And so I went into the sort of back corridors of the Natural History Unit museum and saw all of these showcases of frogs, and was taking Polaroid photographs of frogs, me and the makeup supervisor. And, they went, oh, this is great. We really like this. And that was fun. Yes, he was good. He was terrific. That was a very, very strong cast. And I think it was very much to Kenny Mcbain's theatrical background that he cast some really strong people.
Yes, it's a fantastic cast full of some very well-known actors at the time. And I think with the different sort of cultures aboard the ship, visually, there's an awful lot going on.
Yes, I remember it. That was an all-studio production. We had a lot of fun. And of course, when you were in Television Centre in the studio, Doctor Who was one of the ones that everybody wanted to go and see, and especially if you had the Daleks on the floor. So it was always a problem trying to keep people out of the studio and say, guys, it's lovely to see you, but we're actually trying to do our job here, And I think with Peter Davison coming along, there was a lot of stuff. Oh, I wonder what Peter Davison can do then. A little bit of Schadenfreude, if you like, but actually I think Peter carried it off very well.
Because it's worth saying, at the time you were working on Doctor Who, you'd also worked on Blake Seven sort of simultaneously. Was there a similar interest and excitement to that series as well?
Blake Seven always thought it was a little bit more, a little bit above Doctor Who. It dealt with issues differently, shall we say. They were a lovely bunch of people. On the whole, I think I preferred Doctor Who. I think it just had a lighter touch. Mind you, the Doctor Who episodes were generally 4 or 6 half-hour episodes. And Blake Seven, I think, were individual episodes of 45 or 50 minutes, whatever. Funnily enough, we used exactly the same locations for Blake Seven as we did on Destiny of the Daleks, which made my life a lot easier, because I opened the script and I went, yeah, I know where we can do this. I've got all the paperwork from Doctor Who. Just crank the handle one more time, off we go. Sorry, that makes me look very lazy, but actually it was a good location and it suited Blake Seven as much as it suited Doctor Who.
Of course, you worked on what would be the final Blake's Heaven story. Was there a sense that the series had perhaps run its course, or do you think it could have continued for another year?
There's a good truism of leaving your audience wanting more. And I think there are a lot of programs that outstay their welcome. But of course, nowadays we're seeing revivals of all sorts of programs. Going back to Peter Davison, we're watching Channel 5 remake All Creatures.
Yes, of course. There's this wonderful nostalgia these days that we look back rather than necessarily creating new. Whether that says something about the state of the industry, I don't know.
Do I think the Doctor Who aficionados still hold the rather creaky early episodes in huge esteem, or at least affection, possibly more so than the contemporary ones. I don't know. If you look at Doctor Who since it went to Cardiff, Doctor Who's visuals are quite sophisticated nowadays, and funnily enough, I mean, you could compare them very favorably with early James Bond movies. Something like Doctor No and some of the Cardiff-based Doctor Who's go, hang on a minute, they're pretty indistinguishable.
Yes, the show has certainly come a long way in the last 40 years. But whilst you may not have directed Doctor Who, you did work on series like Jupiter Moon.
I did do some science fiction. I did a show for BSB called Jupiter Moon, which was a stupendously cheap studio-based production out of Birmingham. And when BSB was taken over by Sky weren't allowed to show Jupiter Moon, so they had to pay for it. So Rupert had to pay for it, but he wasn't allowed to show it. So we did quite enjoy that. Yeah, so only about half the episodes got shown in this country on the BSB. Do you remember the Squarial and all the rest? Yes, and My Parents Are Aliens was a children's show, which I did at Yorkshire. That was a lot of fun. And we're using quite sophisticated CG and so on a very low budget. And that was all studio-based. But, modern technology, particularly in editing, post-production and so on, is very liberating.
Yes, it's amazing what can be done these days in post-production. But I was interested that you started out in production, moved into directing. Was there ever any intention to produce?
No, I never wanted to be a producer. I'm on the whole, directors don't get on terribly well with producers. What happened was, I came, a bit like you, I came out of the theatre and had a good start in theatre, and then rather liked Tellyland, and I just liked the ephemeral nature of telly, that you hit first night and then it's history. And certainly when we were making Doctor Who, studio shows, you had to kind of get a whole scene in a take because the editing was crude and expensive and time consuming. So nowadays you wouldn't think twice about dropping a shot in or whatever. Those days you'd have to try and go for a full run if possible. And so studio-based television was an element of, had quite a large element of theatre in it anyway. And yes, it was, I think what happened was when I got into telly, I was already sort of looking up, I can do that, I can do that. Why did you do that? But also you'd be working with very illustrious directors and you go and have lunch with them and say, why did you do that? And they say, oh, well, and actually just you would learn so much from all the people you worked with. And that was an absolute treat. And I hope that people that have worked with me have learned some decent stuff from me. Because what we do as directors working with actors and so on isn't an absolute art. It's very difficult to quantify. directors aren't like cameramen who frame up shots and, you know, have that kind of skill. We just know a bit about everything and somehow got to find actors' G-spots and get a performance out of it. That was something I learned from Leslie Grantham when I cut my teeth as a director on EastEnders. He just said, look, Henry, you know how the technical stuff works. You came up from the floor. He said, just concentrate on the actors, get the performance out of the actors. The crew will dig you out of the shit. You just get on and get, you know, find that G-spot, get the actors going. And that stood me in very good stead, that you actually just care for the actors. You know that the crew are behind you. And quite often I will be spending time with the actors and then saying to just pop over, look over my shoulder to the senior cameraman and say, can you see how it's coming together? And say, yeah, don't worry, boss, we're there, you know. So you're not having to call the shots as such, because you aim to direct it in a way that it shoots itself.
So I was interested that a lot of your work is soap operas, things like Coronation Street, Emmerdale, even things like Jupiter Moon. Do you get that time to rehearse with the actors? Because I appreciate, certainly these days, soaps are quite a machine. Yeah, they churn out a lot of episodes very quickly.
I would call them a sausage factory, even possibly. Soaps are quite hard work. They demand a certain. They're like most other things. You're working on technique, and you're actually working with very, very good actors who are good working actors. Pick up a script and go, yeah, you want me to do that? Oh, I'm gay this week. I'm like, all right, fine. Okay, I can do gay. Whatever. But certainly in the early days of EastEnders, you used to have time in the rehearsal room, and you'd have a run with the producer and show, you know, do the producer's run and get notes from the producer about what you'd done right and wrong, and thereby hang many other tales. But of course, nowadays it's rehearse, record all the way through. And that means that you've got to have done your homework, because somebody will fire something out of left field at you, and you've somehow got to have the answer or know where you're coming from to field that. But I was certainly working with actors. I don't go stand there and say that, you know, you kind of say, you know, you've got all this space to use. I think you might want to get quite close towards the end of this scene, but to begin with, let's see if, you know, and let the actors discover, and then you go, oh, that's nice. I like that bit. Oh, do you mind if you do it this way? I feel happier if you do that. So it is a question of empowering everybody around you as a director, because, you know, if the cameraman is not feeling that his or her contribution is valued, they'll just go, okay, yeah, it's in focus, it will do, you know.
So do you think that pushes sort of more sort of ownership onto a director and relies on actors to be more perhaps instinctive with what they do? Or is that just, you know, actors are taught differently at drama school these days?
Well, I still think a lot of drama school training probably doesn't concentrate enough on screen work. And we're talking about telly here. So I think to assume authorship is slightly fanciful. And actually, you know, we're all techies working together to come up with a product. And we don't call it product, you know, it's something that we put our all into and hope we can be proud of. But in the end, you're just one amongst equals. And you know, you hope that people will want to work with you because you bring a certain energy and style and commitment to what you're doing.
In terms of working on soaps, you had an almost 15-year relationship with Emmerdale. Did it feel like the same sort of show going back to it time and again?
Emmerdale was actually one of my favourite shows because you're filming up in Yorkshire. It's very beautiful. The village is out in the countryside. The crews are delightful and professional, and the actors likewise. Certainly in the early days, Emmerdale was about farming, and you do scenes in the milking shed and all the rest. And now it's got absolutely nothing whatever to do with the countryside. And when I finished doing Emmerdale, I was part of the boring old farts, and my face didn't fit anymore, and I just sort of backed off and went, I don't care enough about the whole environment. It wasn't about a community that lived in a village anymore. It was something else, and it was just emulating all the other soaps and became indistinguishable from them. And as far as I'm concerned, bring back rural concerns, bring back, the trouble is most of the guiding principles seem to be rather metropolitan based. And actually, in the country, you don't have buses. You go and sit in the pub and complain that there are no buses and so on. If they need a bus on Emmerdale, the bus is there. I'm just going into Hotton by bus. So I think Emmerdale's lost its way, but and also when I started directing Emmerdale, the houses people lived in felt like real houses. There was a certain sort of shabbiness and so on. Now everybody lives in a sort of super chic, ITV branded environment that also doesn't reflect how people live, I think.
It's certainly a series that has developed with the times, maybe for the worst. So do you think there is a gap in the market for something about farming, set rurally? For example, All Creatures Great and Small has shown that there is still a love for that sort of story.
I have no doubt that there's a gap because most people live in towns, and most people that I spoke to that used to watch Emmerdale watched it because of the countryside and the animals, because they were living in little flats in Manchester or London or Birmingham and going, oh, look at that. And look at the success of a program like Country File or the revival of All Creatures Great and Small. People want that kind of fantasy of living in a bucolic, living a bucolic existence, I think. You see it with the likes of Netflix too, is that programs are made to an algorithm. These are the boxes that we need to tick to make another, to emulate the success of something else. And I think, there are a lot of debate at the moment about whether programs like The Young Ones or whatever would ever be made nowadays. And I think our television executives are terrified of failure, but actually they're not being very innovative either. There's got to be a safe element. Is it a Broadchurch derivative? In which case, we can bracket it at that. Does it do the repair shop? Does it do this? That's not the right way to be creative.
Do you think that need to tick boxes and to meet the needs of a broadcaster perhaps stifles the director these days, and stops them putting their vision of a script on screen?
I'm sure that is the case. There are very few directors or writer-directors that one could truly call auteurs in Teleland at the moment. And again, their producers, their money men are looking at where does it fit, how can it be marketed, and so on.
Talking of how series are marketed, you worked on El Dorado, which was sort of supposed to show the Brits having retired abroad, but perhaps the quality of maybe the production, the acting wasn't always that well thought of. How was that to work on?
El Dorado was produced by Julius Smith, who had a remarkable success with Tony Holland in creating EastEnders. And of course, the BBC said, okay, you've done it. Let's do it out in Spain and give everybody the sangria and the sex and the sun. And I was having dinner with Julia once, and she said, I don't, you know, I've done it once. I don't think I can do it a second time. I'll give it my best shot. And here we are out in Spain, and we were having a blast. It was a lot of fun. It was a great deal of fun because my children were very young at the time. So they all came out for summer holidays and lived in my little flat down near the beach. So they had bucket and spade holidays, and we were being paid to be out there. And it was great fun. And we were quite isolated from the lousy press back at home. So there we were still making the program and hearing that it was becoming a bit of a laughing stock. People forget that EastEnders, when it started up, wasn't entirely successful. And it took a year for EastEnders to settle down. But El Dorado, yeah, the past is another country, isn't it? And everybody always bursts out laughing when you say, what else have you done? You go, well, El Dorado. And they go, oh, yeah, fine. And you do look at some of them and you go, how did we get away with a performance like that? But yeah, it was a very costly failure from the BBC's point of view. But then, you know, it gave rise to Benidorm, which became very successful, but using a similar idiom. Also, I think, you know, if El Dorado was aspiring to do three episodes a week, just probably, you know, if you're launching a new one, probably aim for 2 a week tops, and then build it up to a third episode. But they were still building the set when we were starting to film, and for looking for naturalism. The sets were all built of concrete and marble, and so they echoed like crazy. And we were told that it had to be recorded in stereo. Now, if you're recording in stereo, every echo gets multiplied dozens of times. And actually, most of the time, you record in mono with a little bit of stereo effect around the edge. So, yes, there were mistakes made at El Dorado, but we had a lot of fun.
Well, that's just as important. You know, you work so hard, such for long days in these things. You know, obviously, the sun helps, but if you're not having fun and enjoying what you're doing, it does become quite a chore, I imagine.
It was a lot of fun in summer, although, of course, in midday, it was seriously hot. But then come the autumn, come the winter, it did become a bit depressing, frankly, you know, because it wasn't holiday place anymore. So you were kind of stuck out there. So, yeah, it was a brave attempt, I think.
I'm aware we've jumped around a lot talking about your career, but were there any directors that particularly inspired you or you learned from, either when you were training or when you were a director yourself?
Yeah, I mean, Mike Newell went on to do 4 Weddings and Funeral. He was a delight to work with. Piers Haggard did Pennies from Heaven. He was a wonderful mentor. There are countless good directors. There are a handful of those that you learned from and say, I'm not going to be like that. And there are tyrants like Julia Smith, who produced EastEnders. I did have one lovely time with Julia because she was producing EastEnders, but she decided to direct the Christmas episode, and I was her first AD, her floor manager. And she was screaming blue murder down the cans at all of us on the floor. And Jeff Feld and I he was the senior cameraman, and going, okay, yeah, right, I understand where she's coming from. And she just came down onto the studio floor, effing and blinding and telling us that we were all useless. We'd already solved the problem by then. And I just said, Julia, off this floor. And she sort of did a double take and turned round and went up the steps of the gallery. And I said to the gallery, can you run tape, please? And by the time she got in the gallery, she didn't have time to talk to anybody. I said action on the floor, and we recorded the scene. And anyway, you know, you can use that or not. Yes, there are people, and generally the bullies are not the people you try and copy. But we did, you learn a lot from people. And also the best directors were the ones you go, boss, have you seen this? And they go, oh yeah, that's like, thanks. I'll use that in a minute.
I'm aware I've taken up far more of your time than I said I would, Henry, and thank you for indulging me, jumping around your career, talking about some of the shows that no doubt myself and viewers have enjoyed. But thank you so much for doing this, and you never know, maybe there's need for a part two at some point. So thank you.
Alex, it's been a blast talking to you. I hope I haven't been a boring old fart. I suspect I may have been. But it's been fun. It's not fair that one should have such fun in one's professional life, is it? Because I think when people look onto a film crew casually and they see people sort of lounging around and laughing and all the rest, and they go, "Oh, well, that's easy, isn't it?" Actually, it's not. But you know, there's that wonderful buzz of creativity and energy and so on that I do miss in the business.